Hi, this is Chris Walker. I was at Best Buy yesterday walking past those massive cardboard pallets of 55-inch TVs stacked right by the front doors. You know the exact ones I'm talking about. Insignia, TCL, Roku, all of them screaming 4K Ultra HD and HDR for like $199. And honestly, my first thought was, what is the catch here? I mean, a 55-inch piece of glass and electronics shipped across the ocean shouldn't cost less than a decent pair of sneakers. It feels illegal. So I bought 3 of them. I hauled them back, threw them in the garage, and basically ran them into the ground to figure out exactly what you're actually getting, and more importantly, what you're sacrificing when you buy a burner TV for the patio or the guest room. Because here's the thing, the specs printed on the side of that box, they are practically fiction. Actually, wait, let me rephrase that. They aren't technically lying, but the brands are absolutely banking on you not knowing what a 250 nit panel looks like when you open the garage door on a sunny Sunday afternoon. If you appreciate this kind of unsponsored, real-world testing where we actually tear past the marketing fluff, do me a massive favor and hit subscribe. It's literally the only way we can keep buying these things out of pocket to tell you the truth. All right, let's look at the actual math behind a $199 TV. Think about the sheer physics of logistics for a second. You have a massive, fragile 55-inch piece of electronics. It has to be manufactured overseas, packed in a giant cardboard box lined with custom molded styrofoam, put on a cargo ship, trucked across the country, and placed on a retail floor where an employee has to physically manage it. Just the shipping, handling, and packaging alone, that has to cost, what, $50? 70? So if the whole thing rings up at $199 at the register, what are you actually paying for on the internal hardware? The processor? The screen itself? You're paying practically nothing because you aren't just buying a television, you are buying a subsidized billboard.
This is the hidden reality of the sub-$200 burner TV market. Companies like Amazon, Roku, and Google are essentially eating the upfront hardware cost or letting manufacturers like TCL and Hisense operate on single-digit margins because the real product is you. The home screen is a heavily monetized real estate zone. Every time you turn on one of these TVs, it is pinging servers, serving you unskippable autoplay ads, and tracking your viewing habits to sell that data. That's not a conspiracy theory. It's literally in their quarterly earnings reports. The TV is cheap because you are paying the rest of the balance with your eyeballs over the next 3 years. But honestly, for a lot of us, that's a totally acceptable trade-off. If I just want to watch college football while I'm changing my oil or throwing darts on the patio, I don't care if Amazon shows me a banner ad for car insurance. What I do care about is whether the thing is actually going to work when I press the power button, or if it's going to melt down the first time the garage hits 95 degrees in July. So, let's start with the king of the loss leaders, the Best Buy Insignia F50 Series 55-inch Fire TV. I bought this one for exactly $199.99, and out of the box, it is incredibly deceptive. You set it up, the colors look reasonably punchy in a dark room, and you think, wow, I just hacked the system. But then you look at the box, and it says 4K Ultra HD with HDR. I need to kill this myth right now because it is the single biggest lie in budget electronics. HDR, high dynamic range, requires 2 things to actually work. It requires a panel that can get blindingly bright, usually over 600 to 1,000 nits, and it requires local dimming zones to turn off the backlight in dark areas of the picture. The Insignia F50 doesn't have either of those things. It's a direct lit LED panel. That means there are just a handful of cheap LED strips glued to the back of the chassis, shining straight through the LCD layer. There is no local dimming. If one pixel needs to be bright, the whole screen gets washed out with this milky, grayish light.
And brightness? I put my colorimeter on this panel and it maxed out at 240 nits. To give you some context, your smartphone screen is probably pushing 800 to 1,000 nits right now.
240 nits is basically a nightlight, so when you feed this TV an HDR movie, like say The Batman or Dune, the TV tries to process that expanded color and light data, realizes it doesn't have the physical hardware to display it, and just crushes the image. It becomes a dark mirror. You will literally just be watching a reflection of yourself sitting on the couch. If you are putting this TV in a brightly lit dorm room, or worse, a garage with the door open, you are going to be fighting glare constantly. But I actually didn't expect the picture quality to be the real deal breaker here. The real trap with the Insignia and anything running Fire OS at this price point is the silicone. They put the absolute cheapest, bare minimum MediaTek system on a chip inside this chassis. We are talking maybe 1.5 to 2 gigabytes of DDR3 RAM. DDR3, that's a memory standard from over a decade ago. Here's what happens in the real world. The first month, the TV feels fine. The UI is reasonably snappy. But as Amazon pushes aggressive background firmware updates, and as the TV caches more data from streaming apps and loads heavier auto-playing video ads onto your home screen, that tiny pool of RAM gets suffocated. By month 6, you're going to press the Netflix button on the remote, and you'll wait 8, 10, sometimes 12 seconds for the app to open. You'll press the volume down button, nothing will happen. You'll press it 3 more times in frustration, and then suddenly the TV will catch up and mute itself all at once. It is infuriating UI friction. It's the kind of daily annoyance that makes you want to throw the remote through the drywall. And speaking of drywall, let's talk about the physical build, because I noticed something strange here. This TV is thick, it's ugly, the bezels are chunky, but I actually think that's a massive advantage for a burner TV. See, premium TVs try to be razor thin, which means all the heat from the power supply is trapped in this tiny glass and metal sandwich. Heat is the enemy of electronics. It dries out capacitors and melts the cheap adhesives holding the panel together. Because the Insignia is basically a hollow plastic tub, there is actually a ton of airflow inside the chassis. If you are mounting this in a non-climate controlled space like a shed or a garage where it's going to experience wild temperature swings, this ugly, chunky plastic design might actually outlive a TV twice its price simply because the power board has room to breathe. So what's the verdict on the Insignia F50? It is purely a monitor. If you buy this, you must treat it like a dumb screen. Do not connect it to your Wi-Fi. Do not use the internal Fire OS. Plug a $30 Roku stick or an Apple TV into the HDMI port. Bypass the internal processor entirely and just use it as a raw display. If you do that, it's a steal. If you rely on the built-in smart features, you'll be miserable by Thanksgiving. Actually, pause for a second. I want to know what you guys are doing with these things. Let me know down in the comments. Are you outfitting a garage gym, a dorm, a patio? What weird, uncontrolled environments are you trying to light up with cheap glass? And what size class should I tear apart next? Let me know below. I'm going to be reading through them tonight. Okay, so if Fire OS is a bloated, laggy mess on cheap hardware, what happens when you switch ecosystems? If you walk 10 feet down that Best Buy aisle, you're going to run into the TCL S4 series, or the S450G depending on the retailer. This one sits right around $240, so it's a slight step up in price. And the marketing pitch here completely shifts. TCL isn't just pushing smart features, they are subtly trying to target the budget gamer, the dorm room guy who just spent all his money on a PS5 and has exactly $0 left for a premium monitor. Now, TCL uses Google TV, and historically, Google TV is a heavy operating system. I was fully expecting this thing to choke just as hard as the Insignia, but I was kind of surprised. TCL actually did something smart here. They prioritized input lag. Input lag is the time it takes for you to pull the trigger on your controller and the gun to actually fire on screen. On a lot of cheap TVs, there's this muddy, heavy delay, maybe 40 or 50 milliseconds. It makes playing anything competitive feel like you're moving underwater. I hooked up an HDMI tester to the S4, put it in game mode, and it registered around 11 milliseconds of input lag. That is remarkably fast. That's bordering on dedicated gaming monitor territory. For a $240 TV, that is an engineering win. But, and this is a massive radioactive but, you pay a severe price for that gaming performance. When you turn on the TCL S4 and just try to watch a normal YouTube video or a news broadcast, you are going to notice something horribly wrong with the picture. The out-of-the-box color calibration on this TV isn't just bad, it is aggressively, intentionally wrong. I spent about 45 minutes diving into the TCL's white balance and color calibration menus trying to fix this. And you can get it closer to reality, sure, but you have to ask yourself why it ships like this out of the box. It's actually a brilliant, if slightly manipulative, retail strategy. TCL knows this TV is sitting on a brightly lit showroom floor at Target or Best Buy next to OLEDs that cost 10 times as much. To keep your eye from realizing how dim the backlight actually is, they crank the color saturation to absolute maximum. It creates this artificial pop that looks impressive from 20 feet away in the store. But when you put it in a dimly lit dorm room, everybody looks like they have a severe sunburn. And the panel technology itself is fighting you here too. They don't put this on the box because why would they want you to know, but the TCL S4 uses a VA panel, or vertical alignment. Actually, let me explain why this matters, because it's a physical hardware limitation, not a software bug. VA panels are famous for having pretty solid contrast if you are sitting perfectly dead center. But the second you move off axis, say you're walking over to the mini fridge in your dorm, or you're working on a workbench on the side of your garage, the color accuracy just falls off a cliff. The image washes out completely. So if you're buying this TV for a group setting, a patio where people are scattered around, or a wide living room, half your guests are going to be looking at a terrible, faded picture. You are actively sacrificing viewing angles to get that low 11 millisecond gaming input lag. That is the TCL trade-off. If that sounds like too much friction and you just want the absolute most bulletproof, idiot-proof experience where you never have to calibrate a single color setting, you have to look at the Roku Select 55-inch. I bought this one for about $240, and honestly, the physical television itself is incredibly uninspiring. The plastic feels cheap, the legs are these flimsy little V-shaped twigs that feel like they might snap if you bump the table, but the software is the saving grace of this entire price bracket. We talked about how Fire OS and Google TV eventually choke on the terrible 1.5 gigabytes of RAM these manufacturers put in these motherboards. Roku OS is different. It is brutally simple. It is basically just a glorified grid of HTML shortcuts. There are no heavy background animations, there are no massive auto-playing video trailers chewing up your system memory. I've looked at the long-term data on this, and Roku TVs consistently outlast Fire TVs in terms of daily usability simply because the operating system is so lightweight. In 3 years, when the Insignia is taking 12 seconds to load Netflix, the Roku is still going to snap it open in 3. But, and there is always a but at this price, the Roku Select hides its biggest flaw right at the bottom of the chassis. The audio on this TV is borderline unacceptable. I know nobody expects home theater surround sound from a $200 burner TV, but I'm talking about basic vocal clarity. The acoustic chambers inside this plastic shell are virtually non-existent. The drivers are tiny, maybe 8 or 10 watts, and they fire straight down into whatever table the TV is sitting on. I noticed this immediately when I had the garage door open. A car drove by outside, not a loud truck, just a normal sedan, and it completely drowned out the dialogue of the YouTube video I was watching. The volume was at 80% and the speakers were just distorting and rattling the plastic chassis. It sounded like music playing through a tin can. So, here is the math problem. You buy the Roku because the software is reliable, but you physically cannot hear it over a treadmill or a running grill on the patio or a noisy street. So, you're forced to go buy a $70 budget soundbar just to hear the news.
Well, congratulations! Your $240 cheap TV just became a $310 TV. And at $310, you are entering an entirely different tier of television, where you could have just bought a better panel with better speakers to begin with. It's a classic budget trap. The manufacturer saves $4 on speaker magnets, and you end up spending $70 to fix their mistake. This brings me to the Hisense A6. This one hovers right around $240 to $260 depending on the week.
If your primary enemy is the sun, say you are putting this under a covered patio or in a room with a ton of uncovered windows, this is the only TV in this lineup that actually tries to fight back. Hisense generally pushes the voltage on their backlight LEDs just a little bit harder than TCL or LG's budget lines. I put the light meter on this one, and it was consistently hitting about 290, sometimes 300 nits in SDR mode. That doesn't sound like a massive jump over the Insignia's 240 nits, but human vision is funny. That extra 50 nits is exactly the threshold you need to cut through ambient daylight. It's the difference between squinting to see the score of the game and actually being able to relax and watch it. I didn't expect to like the Hisense. Their quality control on the low end is notoriously chaotic, but sitting here in a bright garage, it is undeniably the easiest screen to actually see. However, Hisense relies on what the enthusiast community calls the panel lottery. When you are mass-producing panels at this price, the diffuser layers, the physical plastic sheets inside the screen that spread the LED light evenly across the glass, are incredibly cheap, and they aren't always pressed perfectly flat. Watch what happens when the camera pans across this soccer field. Do you see those dark, dirty-looking vertical smudges? It almost looks like someone wiped a greasy rag down the inside of the glass. That is called DSE, the dirty screen effect. It happens because the backlight isn't uniform. On a premium TV, this would be an instant return. On a $240 Hisense, it is just a fact of life. You won't notice it when you're watching a dark movie or playing a video game with a lot of static menus. But the second you watch hockey or soccer or anything with a massive uniform block of color that pans side to side, those jail bars are going to be staring right back at you. I want you guys to weigh in on this actually. Look closely at that footage. Would that dirty screen effect drive you crazy? Or for $250, do you just accept it and drink another beer? I know AV purists who would throw this thing off a balcony, but for a patio TV, I'm honestly torn. Let me know in the comments where your line is for this kind of visual artifact. Because here's the ultimate truth about every single TV we just looked at. The Insignia, the TCL, the Roku, the Hisense, none of them are built to last. When you buy a TV under $300, you are not buying a 10-year appliance. You are buying a consumable. And I want to explain exactly how these things die, so you know what you are getting into when you mount it in a harsh environment. Almost nobody throws away a cheap TV because the processor gets too slow. They throw them away because of year 3 structural failure. Inside these TVs, you have the power supply board and you have the LED backlight strips. These TVs are almost all direct lit, meaning the LEDs sit right behind the screen. LEDs generate heat. The power board generates a ton of heat. Now, imagine you put this TV in your garage. In the summer, that garage might hit 100 degrees Fahrenheit during the day. At night, it drops to 65 degrees. The plastic chassis expands and contracts. The cheap solder joints on the power board expand and contract, over and over, day after day. These manufacturers are using the absolute cheapest, lowest grade thermal paste and lead-free solder allowed by law. They designed thermal venting for an air-conditioned 70-degree living room. What happens in year 2 or 3 is predictable. The constant heat cycling microfractures the solder joints on the power supply. One day you press the power button, the standby light blinks 3 times, and the TV just stays dead. The board is fried. Or the alternative death, the LED strips burn out. Because these panels are so dim to begin with, you are inevitably going to go into the settings and crank the backlight to 100% just to see the picture. You are running those cheap LED diodes at maximum voltage, 24/7. Eventually, a diode simply burns up. When that happens, a third of your screen will instantly go dark. The TV still works, you can still hear the audio, but the top half of the picture looks like it's covered in a heavy black shadow. Technically, you can buy replacement LED strips on eBay for $20, but to install them, you have to use suction cups to physically remove the fragile LCD glass without snapping it, replace the strips, and rebuild the TV. It takes 2 hours, it's incredibly stressful, and 90% of normal people will just throw the TV in a dumpster and go buy another $199 Insignia. That is the planned obsolescence loop of the burner TV. It's cheaper to replace it than to fix it. So if every single one of these sub-$200 TVs is essentially a ticking thermal time bomb, how do you actually make a choice? Because you still need a TV for the patio, you still need something for the guest room that isn't going to cost you a mortgage payment. The secret to buying a burner TV isn't finding the perfect picture quality. It's about aggressively matching the exact flaw of the television to the specific room you are putting it in so that you never actually notice the flaw. Let me explain that better, because this is where most people waste their money. They buy the TCL S4 on sale for their bright living room, not realizing the VA panel is going to wash out the second their kids sit on the floor to the side of the couch. They buy the wrong flaw for the wrong room. If you are outfitting a guest bedroom, a room that gets used maybe 4 weekends a year by your parents or your in-laws, you have one priority and one priority only: software stability. You do not want a text message at 11:30 at night from your mother-in-law asking how to switch the input back to the HDMI port because the Fire TV home screen crashed and served her an ad for dog food. For that exact scenario, you buy the Roku Select. Yes, the speakers are terrible. Yes, they sound like a cell phone trapped inside a Tupperware container. But in a quiet 12 by 12 guest room, nobody cares. What they care about is picking up a remote with exactly 4 purple buttons, pressing one of them, and the TV actually doing what it is supposed to do immediately. Roku's operating system is essentially a digital brick. It is dumb, it is ugly, and it almost never breaks. You are buying the Roku to avoid IT support duties in your own house. Now, if you're dropping a TV into a college dorm room or a dedicated corner of the basement where a teenager is going to play Xbox for 6 hours a day, the math completely changes. You don't care about the Roku's simple menus. You care about latency. In that highly specific scenario, the TCL S4 becomes the absolute undisputed winner. That 11 millisecond input lag we measured earlier, it completely changes how games feel. When you pull the trigger in a shooter or hit the brakes in a racing game, the car actually stops. It feels connected. And here's the reality of a dorm room. Nobody cares about the terrible off-axis viewing angles of that VA panel because the person playing the game is sitting dead center 3 feet away, staring directly into the middle of the glass. The flaw is completely masked by the environment. They will never notice the skin tones look slightly neon because they're too busy looking at a digital crosshair. But what if you're going outside? What if you're mounting a screen to the brick wall of your patio or throwing it above the workbench in a 2-car garage with the doors wide open? This is where the Hisense A6 actually makes a lot of sense, despite the panel lottery and that dirty screen effect we talked about. When you're fighting literal sunlight, subtle color accuracy and pristine screen uniformity go completely out the window. You just need raw, unadulterated nits. You need a backlight that can punch through the glare so you can see the score of the baseball game while you're flipping burgers 20 feet away. The Hisense pushes its LEDs just hard enough to survive in that environment. And honestly, if you're walking around a patio with a drink in your hand, you aren't going to notice the slight vertical banding on the glass. The environment hides the manufacturing shortcut. But I almost ignored this, and that would have been a massive mistake for those of you trying to be smart about this. There is a fourth type of buyer. The system hacker, the person who refuses to deal with the slow menus, refuses to deal with the privacy-invading ad trackers, and just wants a massive, cheap piece of glass. If you already own an Apple TV 4K, or an NVIDIA Shield, or a high-end Roku Ultra box, the $199 Insignia F50 is actually the smartest purchase on this table. Because here is the ultimate truth bomb about the budget TV market. The screens themselves, the actual liquid crystal displays, are mostly manufactured by the exact same 3 massive factories in China and Taiwan, regardless of what logo is slapped on the plastic bezel. The difference between a $200 and a $400 TV is rarely the glass. It's the processor. It's the image upscaling algorithm. It's the amount of RAM they soldered onto the motherboard to run the smart interface. When you buy the $199 Insignia, take it home and never connect it to your Wi-Fi router, you are cutting off
off the poison. The TV can't download bloated updates. It can't load heavy video ads on the home screen. It never gets bogged down. You plug your Apple TV into HDMI 1, you set the TV to turn on directly to that input, and you essentially lobotomize the television. It becomes a pure, dumb monitor. Your Apple TV handles all the heavy lifting, all the processing, all the fast menu navigation, and suddenly that $199 piece of cheap plastic feels incredibly fast and premium. You are offloading the exact components that the manufacturer cheaped out on. But I need to warn you about something, and this is exactly why I don't trust the labels on these boxes anymore. You have to be incredibly careful about the revision trap. This happens constantly in the budget TV space, especially around Black Friday or March Madness. A company will release a TV in January. Let's say it's the TCL S4. Reviewers like me will buy it, test it, say it has great input lag, and recommend it.
But then, in October, right before the holiday shopping season, the manufacturer will quietly swap out the internal components to save money. They will switch from a reasonably bright VA panel to an ultra-cheap dim IPS panel. They will downgrade the Wi-Fi chip. They keep the exact same box, the exact same marketing, and the exact same model name. Maybe they just add a tiny letter B to the end of the barcode on the back. You think you were buying the TV that got great reviews, but you were actually buying a stripped-down, inferior revision designed specifically to hit a $179 Black Friday doorbuster price. This is why buying budget electronics is a minefield. You aren't just fighting bad specs, you are fighting actively deceptive supply chains. All right, so let's land the plane here. You have $250, you need a 55-inch TV. What is the actual verdict? If I'm forced to pick a best overall, the TV that's going to cause the least amount of friction for the highest number of people, it is the Roku Select series. I know the audio is genuinely tragic. I know the picture quality isn't going to blow anyone away. But in the budget tier, longevity and software reliability trump everything else. A TV that turns on fast and loads an app without crashing in year 3 is far more valuable than a TV that gets slightly brighter but freezes every time you press the volume button. Just plan on buying a cheap soundbar eventually and you'll be fine. But if we're talking about best value, the absolute smartest way to spend your money, it's the $199 Insignia paired with a dedicated streaming box. If you treat these cheap TVs as disposable monitors and refuse to rely on their internal hardware, you completely bypass the trap these companies set up for you. You get the cheap glass and you keep your sanity. Now, because of that revision trap I just talked about, where brands secretly swap out the panels mid-year, you have to be careful which exact model number you're putting in your cart. I spend an unreasonable amount of time tracking these silent hardware revisions.
Down in the description, I've linked out to the vetted, safe versions of these TVs, the specific listings that haven't been swapped out for cheaper Black Friday downgrade panels. If you use those links, you guarantee you are getting the hardware we actually tested today, and it helps support this channel so we can keep buying these things and ripping them apart without having to take a sponsor check from the brands themselves. The budget TV market is a massive game of compromises, but as long as you know exactly which compromise you are making before you open your wallet, you can actually win. I'm Chris Walker. I'll see you in the comments.